The air in County Superior Courtroom 4B smelled of floor wax, stale coffee, and the sour metallic tang of ruined lives. It was a smell I knew well, not from courtrooms, but from the aftermath of fires, the damp, heavy scent of things that had been destroyed beyond repair. I sat at the defense table, my wrists resting on the scarred wood. The steel handcuffs bit into the thin, papery skin of my wrists, a cold reminder of my new reality. I adjusted my shoulders, trying to find a comfortable position, but it was impossible. The orange jumpsuit they had dressed me in was 2 sizes too big. It hung off my gaunt frame like a shroud, bunching at the waist and pooling around my ankles. It was made of a rough synthetic material that scratched against my skin, but the itch was nothing compared to the burning shame that radiated from my chest. I am Silas Black. For 40 years, I wore a uniform that commanded respect. I was a firefighter. I walked into burning buildings when everyone else was running out. I carried children through smoke that was thick enough to chew. I was a hero in this county. Today, I am just an inmate number. I am a violent senior citizen. I am a burden. The people call for the maximum sentence, Your Honor, the prosecutor droned. He was a young man with a sharp suit and a haircut that cost more than my monthly pension. He didn't look at me. To him, I was just a case file, a statistic to be cleared before lunch. I looked at my hands. They were trembling. Not from dementia, as they claimed, but from a rage so cold and profound it felt like ice in my veins. I turned my head slowly to look at the gallery. The wooden benches were packed. My neighbors were there. Mrs. Higgins, who I had shoveled snow for every winter for 20 years. Mr. Henderson, whose cat I had rescued from a drainage pipe. They were whispering, their heads leaned together, eyes darting toward me with a mixture of fear and pity. "It's tragic," I heard Mrs. Higgins whisper, her voice carrying in the acoustically perfect room. "He just snapped." Marcus. He sat in the front row, directly behind the prosecutor's table. He was wearing a foam neck brace that pushed his chin up at an awkward angle. His left arm was in a sling. He held a white handkerchief to his face, dabbing at dry eyes with the practiced grace of a stage actor. He looked devastated. He looked terrified. He looked like the victim. Marcus was my stepson. He was the son of my late wife, Eleanor. When Eleanor passed away 3 months ago, taken by a stroke that hit us like a thief in the night, Marcus had shown up at the funeral wearing a black suit and a mask of grief. I hadn't seen him in 10 years. He had drifted in and out of our lives, usually appearing only when he needed money for a surefire investment or to bail himself out of some trouble in the city. But at the funeral, he had held my arm. "I'm here for you, Silas," he had said. I believed him. I was drowning in the silence of the big, empty house Eleanor and I had shared for 30 years. I was lonely. Grief is a heavy coat, and I was tired of carrying it alone. So when Marcus asked if he could stay for a few weeks to help me get organized, I said yes. That was the first mistake. The memories of the last 3 months played out in my mind, overlaying the prosecutor's speech. The help Marcus offered had felt more like a suffocation. It started small. He rearranged the furniture. He threw out Eleanor's magazines. Then things started to disappear. My coin collection, the silver candlesticks. "I took them to be cleaned, Silas," he would say, flashing a bright, patient smile. I wasn't forgetting. My mind was sharp. My lungs were scarred by smoke. My heart was heavy, but my brain was a steel trap. I knew he was selling them. Then came the isolation. He changed the password on the Wi-Fi. He told me the landline was broken. When my friends called, he told them I was sleeping or sick or confused. "He's having a bad day," he would tell them at the door, blocking their view of me sitting in the living room. I tried to kick him out. Last week I told him to leave. "This is my house, Marcus," I had said, standing in the kitchen. He had laughed. It was a cold, ugly sound. "You can't live here alone, old man. You're incompetent." It was Tuesday. I was making tea in the kitchen. The kettle was whistling. Marcus walked in. He smelled of whiskey and aggression. He had just gotten off the phone with someone, a realtor, I suspected. "It's time, Silas," he said. I asked, turning off the stove. He walked over to the knife block. He pulled out the carving knife, the big one with the 8-inch blade. He looked at it, testing the weight. I asked, stepping back. Marcus smiled. "The will says that if you are incapacitated, incarcerated, or deceased, the estate transfers to me immediately." I checked the clause. He stepped into my personal space. He grabbed my right hand, my dominant hand. He forced the handle of the knife into my grip. His fingers were strong, younger than mine. He squeezed my hand around the wood until my knuckles cracked. "Don't drop it," he whispered. Then he did the unthinkable. He leaned forward and smashed his own face against the granite countertop. Crack! The sound was sickening. Blood sprayed from his nose instantly, splattering across his white shirt and onto the floor. "Da!" he screamed. "Help me!" He threw himself backward, crashing into the table, knocking chairs over. He grabbed his arm and twisted it, slamming his elbow against the doorframe. "Da!" he shrieked. I stood there, frozen, the knife still in my hand. I was in shock. I had faced infernos that melted steel, but I had never seen a human being self-destruct with such calculated malice. The neighbors heard him. They always heard everything. Within minutes, the blue lights were flashing in the driveway. The police kicked down the door. They found Marcus bleeding on the floor, sobbing, pointing a shaking finger at me. They found me standing over him, holding the knife, looking confused and terrified. "Da!" they screamed. I dropped it. But the damage was done. The narrative was set. Violent, demented old man attacks helpless stepson. I sat there at the defense table, listening to the prosecutor paint me as a monster, realizing that the man I raised as my own son, the boy I had taught to throw a baseball, had orchestrated my complete destruction for a payout. He didn't just want my house, he wanted my life. He wanted to bury me in a cell so he could cash a check. I looked down at the table, the grain of the wood blurring as my eyes stung. If you've ever sat in silence while a liar destroyed your reputation, if you've ever felt the walls closing in because the truth was too quiet to be heard over the noise of a performance, hit subscribe. You need to see what happened when I rolled up my sleeve, because sometimes the only evidence that matters is the map of pain you carry on your skin. The prosecutor sat down, looking pleased with himself. "Your Honor," my public defender said, standing up. He was a kid, barely out of law school. His suit was ill-fitting, and he looked exhausted. He had spent 10 minutes with me before the trial. He had told me to plead guilty. "Take the deal, Silas. 5 years in a psychiatric facility. It's better than prison." I had refused. I would not admit to a lie. "My client," the kid stammered, "has a clean record. 40 years of service to the city. We ask for leniency." It was a weak defense. It was a surrender. Marcus dabbed his eyes again. I saw a smirk twitch at the corner of his mouth behind the handkerchief. He knew he had won. He was probably already spending the money in his head. Judge Holloway cleared his throat. I looked up at the bench. Judge Holloway was a legend in this county. He was 70 years old, with a face carved from granite and eyes that missed nothing. He had a reputation for maximum sentencing. He didn't tolerate violence. He didn't tolerate excuses. He looked down at me over his half-moon spectacles. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were cold. He looked tired. He saw another violent senior citizen, another tragedy of aging, another burden on the state's resources. "Mr. Black," the judge said. His voice was a deep rumble that vibrated in the floorboards. "You have been found guilty of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon." He paused, shuffling the papers on his desk. "This court takes elder violence very seriously. However, it also takes violence committed by the elderly seriously." Marcus let out a small, audible sob. It was perfect timing. "No?" the judge asked, looking directly at me. My lawyer nudged me. "Stand up," he hissed. "Say you're sorry." I stood up. My legs were weak. My knees popped. The chains on my ankles rattled, a sound that echoed through the silent courtroom. I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. I looked at the prosecutor. I looked at the neighbors who had turned their backs on me. Then I looked at Marcus. He lowered the handkerchief slightly. His eyes met mine. They were bright with triumph. "Got you," his eyes said. "You're done, old man." I looked up at the judge. "I didn't do it," I said. My voice was raspy, unused for weeks, but it was steady. "The jury disagreed," Judge Holloway said sternly. "No," I said. I didn't speak the words I had rehearsed in my cell. I didn't try to explain the will or the money or the lies. Words had failed me. The narrative was too strong. Action was all I had left. I reached for the left cuff of my orange jumpsuit with my handcuffed hands. It was awkward. My fingers fumbled with the button. The prosecutor asked, standing up. The bailiff, a large man with a hand on his taser, took a step toward me. "Let him be," Judge Holloway commanded. I undid the button. I grabbed the fabric of the sleeve. Slowly, deliberately, I rolled up the orange material. I rolled it past my wrist, past the handcuffs, past the thin, pale skin of my forearm. I rolled it up to my elbow. I held my arm up. The courtroom lights hit the flesh. It wasn't skin, not anymore. It was a ruin. It was a landscape of twisted, melted tissue. A thick, ropey burn scar spiraled from my wrist all the way to the crook of my elbow. It was angry, red and white, a topographical map of agony. It looked like melted wax that had hardened over bone. It was an ugly, violent mark. It was the legacy of the worst night of my life. November 14th, 1984. The night the St. Jude's Home for Boys burned to the ground. I held my arm out, turning it so the light caught the ridge of the scar tissue. The courtroom went silent. It wasn't the polite silence of before. It was a stunned, breathless silence. The kind of silence that happens when something raw and real intrudes on a polite fiction. I looked at the judge. Judge Holloway's eyes locked onto the scar. He froze. His pen, which he had been holding poised over the sentencing document, slipped from his fingers. It clattered onto the wood of the bench, loud as a gunshot. He stared at my arm. His mouth opened slightly. The mask of judicial indifference, the granite face of hard-line Holloway, began to crumble. His eyes widened. His breathing hitched. He knew that scar. He didn't just recognize the type of burn. He recognized the shape of it. He recognized the specific pattern of the melted polyester shirt that had fused to my skin 40 years ago. He had seen it before. He had seen it through the thick, choking black smoke of a basement hallway. He had seen it illuminated by the orange glow of a collapsing roof. He had seen it inches from his face, shielding him from the falling beam that should have killed him. "Mister," the judge whispered. His voice wasn't booming anymore. It was trembling. I nodded slowly. "It's me, Bobby," I said softly, using a name no one in that courtroom knew. The judge stood up. His chair scraped violently against the floor. His robe rustled loudly in the quiet room. He ignored the lawyers. He ignored the bailiff. He ignored Marcus, whose smirk had faltered into confusion. Judge Holloway leaned over the bench, staring at me with the intensity of a man seeing a ghost rise from the grave. "November 14th, the judge said, his voice shaking. 1984, I finished for him. I pulled 3 boys out of that basement. The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The prosecutor looked from me to the judge, his mouth agape. Marcus stood up, panic flashing in his eyes. He sensed the shift. He felt the ground turning to quicksand beneath his feet. "Marcus!" shouted, his voice shrill. "I object! What is this? What does his old injury have to do with the fact that he tried to stab me? He's manipulating you!" Judge Holloway turned his head slowly to look at Marcus. The sadness in the judge's eyes vanished. It was replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. It was the look of a man who had spent a lifetime judging the guilty, fueled by the memory of the night he almost died. "Sit down," the judge said. The command was soft, but it carried the weight of a falling hammer. "Holloway!" roared. Marcus collapsed back into his seat, clutching his neck brace. The judge turned back to me. He looked at the scar on my arm one last time. Then he looked me in the eye. "Mr. Reynolds," the judge said to Marcus, though he kept his eyes on me, "you asked what this has to do with the case." He paused, his hands gripping the edge of the bench until his knuckles were white. "Because a man who sacrifices his own flesh to save strangers, a man who covers a terrified 10-year-old boy with his own body to shield him from a falling beam." The judge sat back down. He picked up his pen, but he didn't write. He looked at the prosecutor. "And I remember something else about that night," Holloway said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He turned his gaze to Marcus. "Let's review the evidence again," the judge said. The atmosphere in the courtroom didn't just shift, it shattered. One moment, the air was thick with the stale, bureaucratic boredom of a sentencing hearing, and the next, it was electric, charged with the kind of high-voltage tension that precedes a lightning strike. I stood there, my arm raised, the scar tissue gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights like a map of a foreign country. I watched Judge Holloway. I watched the color drain from his face, leaving him looking less like a figure of authority and more like a man who had seen a ghost walk through the wall. He stood up. The movement was abrupt, uncoordinated. His heavy black robe rustled loudly in the dead silence, sounding like the wings of a giant bird. He wasn't looking at the prosecutor, who was frozen with his mouth half open. He wasn't looking at my public defender, who looked like he wanted to crawl under the table. He wasn't looking at Marcus. He was staring at my arm. He was staring at the twisted, melted flesh that I had carried for 40 years. "Where did you get that burn, mister?" The judge's voice trembled. It wasn't the booming baritone that had commanded the room 5 minutes ago. It was thin, reedy, stripped of all judicial pretense. It was the voice of a human being asking a question that terrified him. I lowered my arm slowly, but I didn't button the cuff. I let the scar breathe. "St. Jude's Home for Boys," I answered. My voice was raspy, worn down by weeks of silence, but it filled the room. November 14th, 1984. It was a 3-alarm fire. The basement access was blocked by debris. I went in through the coal chute. The judge closed his eyes. His hand, which had been gripping the gavel, went slack. He brought a trembling hand up to his face, covering his mouth as if to stifle a cry. A single tear, stark and shocking on his granite face, tracked through the deep lines of his cheek. "I was the 3rd boy," he whispered. The words were barely audible, but in the vacuum of the courtroom, they sounded like a thunderclap. "You," he continued, opening his eyes and looking directly into mine. "You covered me. I remember the smell of your coat. It was wool and smoke. The beam came down, and you put your arm over my head." The revelation hit the courtroom like a physical blow. A collective gasp sucked the oxygen out of the space. The neighbors in the gallery, who had been whispering about my dementia and my violence, sat frozen, their mouths agape. The prosecutor dropped his pen. Marcus stopped smirking. I watched the realization hit him. It started in his eyes, a flicker of confusion, a darting panic. He looked from me to the judge, trying to calculate the odds, trying to understand how the ground had suddenly turned to quicksand beneath his feet. He sensed the narrative slipping away from him. He sensed the danger. He stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "Marcus," shouted, his voice shrill and desperate, "I object. What is this? What does his old injury have to do with the fact that he tried to stab me? This is a sentencing hearing. He's manipulating you." Judge Holloway turned his head slowly. He looked at Marcus. The sadness in the judge's eyes vanished instantly. It was replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. It was the look of a man who had spent a lifetime judging the guilty, fueled by the primal memory of the night he almost died. He sat back down in his high leather chair, but he didn't look like a judge anymore. He looked like an avenging angel. "It has everything to do with character, Mr. Reynolds," the judge said. His voice was low, dangerous, a growl of thunder on the horizon. "Because a man who sacrifices his own flesh to save strangers, a man who covers a terrified 10-year-old boy with his own body to shield him from a falling beam." The judge leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Marcus like a targeting system. "And I remember something else about that night," Holloway said. "I remember the smell. Not just the smoke. I remember the smell of accelerant, kerosene. Someone set that fire on purpose. I know what an arsonist smells like." The courtroom was paralyzed. The bailiff had his hand on his taser, but he didn't know who to aim it at. "Your Honor," the prosecutor stammered, I must ask for a recess. This is highly irregular." "I will not recuse myself," Holloway snapped. "I am the finder of fact in this sentencing phase, and I have just found a new fact." The prosecutor sat. The judge turned his gaze back to Marcus. "Mr. Reynolds, step forward to the witness stand." Marcus argued, his face flushing red. "I am reopening the evidentiary phase based on new character evidence," Holloway said. Marcus walked to the stand. He moved stiffly, favoring his injured leg, but the performance was fraying at the edges. He sat down, adjusting his neck brace, looking at the jury box as if seeking allies. There were none. "You claim Mr. Black attacked you in the kitchen," the judge said. He didn't look at his notes. He looked at Marcus. "Yes," Marcus said, his voice gaining a little strength. "He was screaming." "His right hand," Marcus said quickly. "And you are 40 years old?" "I work out," Marcus said defensively. "Mr. Black is 78 years old," the judge said. "He walks with a cane. He has stage 2 COPD from smoke inhalation. And yet, you claim he overpowered you?" "Mr. insisted. It was hysterical strength." "Let's talk about the wound," the judge said. He picked up the crime scene photos. "Your nose was broken. Your cheekbone was bruised, but there were no defensive wounds on your hands, no cuts." I watched Marcus. He was sweating now. A bead of perspiration rolled down his temple and vanished into the foam of his neck brace. I was in shock," Marcus stammered. I didn't want to hurt him." "No, he did that," the judge asked. "He held the knife in his right hand, so he grabbed your head with his left, Mr." I held up my left hand. It was shaking, the tremors of age and stress undeniable. It was a hand that had trouble opening a jar of pickles. Marcus screamed. "I think you remember it perfectly," Holloway said. "I think you remember gripping the knife yourself. I think you remember the angle of the counter." Marcus stood up in the witness box. "He's brainwashing you." I stood there, the scar still exposed, the orange fabric bunched at my elbow. I felt a strange calm settle over me. The truth was out. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a shout. I reached into the pocket of my jumpsuit. It was the only personal item they had allowed me to keep, deemed harmless by the intake guard. I pulled out a small blackened object. It was a locket. It was warped by heat, the silver tarnished to a dull charcoal gray. "I save things, Marcus," I said quietly. The room went quiet again. Marcus looked at me. "I don't destroy things," I said, holding up the locket. "This was from the fire. I went back for it. It belonged to the matron. I couldn't save her, but I saved this." I looked him dead in the eye. "You throw things away," I said. "You threw away my wife's magazines. You threw away my coin collection." Marcus sneered. The mask slipped completely. "You're a hoarder, Silas. A senile old hoarder living in a gold mine." "Bailiff," the judge said sharply. Marcus froze. "Your phone," Holloway commanded. "Probable cause for perjury and conspiracy to commit fraud. Hand it over." Marcus yelled, clutching his pocket. "That's private property." "You have the right to remain silent," the judge said. The bailiff moved fast. He stepped into the witness box. Marcus tried to pull away, but the bailiff grabbed his wrist and fished the smartphone from his jacket pocket. He handed it to the judge. "Unlock it," the judge ordered. Marcus stared at the judge. He looked at the bailiff. He looked at the door. He realized there was no way out. With a shaking hand, he punched in the code. The judge took the phone. He scrolled. The silence in the room was excruciating. It stretched for a minute, 2 minutes. Then the judge stopped scrolling. He looked up. His expression was one of pure disgust. "Text message to Realtor Steve, dated 2 days ago," the judge read aloud. "Get the listing ready. The old man is going down on Tuesday. I'll have power of attorney by Friday." A gasp went through the gallery. "Text message to Ashley, dated last night," the judge continued. "My nose hurts like hell, but it's worth it. The performance was Oscar-worthy." He looked so confused holding that knife. The judge set the phone down. He looked at the prosecutor. "Counselor," Holloway said, "do you still wish to pursue charges against Mr.?" The prosecutor looked pale. He stood up, buttoning his jacket. "No, Your Honor. The state moves to dismiss all charges with prejudice." "Granted," the judge said. He banged the gavel. It sounded like a gunshot. "Mr. Black, you are free to go. The restraints." The bailiff hurried over to me. He unlocked the cuffs. The steel fell away from my wrists. I rubbed the chafed skin. I was free. "But I am not done," the judge said. He pointed a finger at Marcus, who was standing in the witness box, looking like a man watching his own execution. "Mr. Reynolds, you are hereby remanded into custody. I am charging you with perjury, filing a false police report, attempted grand larceny, and elder abuse. Bail is denied." Marcus screamed as the bailiff grabbed him. "No, it's a misunderstanding." The bailiff spun him around. He pulled the same handcuffs that had been on my wrists seconds ago from his belt. He snapped them onto Marcus's wrists. Click, click. The sound was beautiful. The room erupted. The neighbors, the people who had shunned me, who had shaken their heads at my decline, were standing up. They were cheering. Mrs. Higgins was clapping. Marcus was dragged out of the courtroom, screaming, begging, blaming everyone but himself. I stood there, rubbing my wrists. I felt light, weightless. The judge stepped down from the bench. He didn't go to his chambers. He walked across the well of the court. He was stripped of his robe now, just a man in a shirt and tie. He looked older without the black silk. He stopped in front of me. He was tall, but he looked at me with the reverence of a child looking at a giant. He didn't say a word. He just extended his hand. I took it. His grip was firm, warm. His eyes were wet. He reached out with his other hand and gently touched the scar on my forearm.
He traced the ridge of the melted skin with a trembling finger. "Thank you," he whispered.
"You did good, kid," I said, my voice thick with emotion. I walked out of the courtroom. The hallway was empty. The air was cool. I walked down the steps of the courthouse. The sun was setting, casting a gold and fiery light over the city skyline. It painted the concrete in shades of amber and rose. I sat down on the bottom step. I watched the police cruiser pull away from the curb. Marcus's face pressed against the glass in the back seat, shouting silent words that no one would ever listen to again. I rolled down my sleeve, I buttoned a cuff. I rubbed the fabric over the scar. For 40 years, it had been a source of pain, a reminder of loss, a disfigurement that I hid from the world. Now, I felt the ridge of it under the cloth. It felt solid. It felt like steel. It wasn't a mark of shame. It was the reason I was sitting here, breathing the free air. It was the reason I still had a life. I was alone. Eleanor was gone. Marcus was gone. The house would be empty and quiet, but it would be my quiet. I took a deep breath, filling my scarred lungs with the evening air. It tasted sweet. I stood up, gripped the railing, and began the long walk home.